December 22nd, 1989. The most feared dictator in Eastern Europe stands on a palace balcony, waving to what he believes are adoring crowds below. Within minutes, those same crowds will be screaming for his blood. Within 72 hours, Nicolae Ceausescu will be dead, executed by firing squad after the most dramatic fall from power in modern history. But the true horror wasn't just in how quickly his 24-year reign crumbled. It was in the calculated brutality of his final 3 days, a period so savage that even hardened revolutionaries would later admit they had never witnessed anything quite like it. This is the untold story of those last hours, when one of history's most ruthless tyrants discovered that the very people he had terrorized for decades were about to repay every ounce of suffering he had inflicted. Nicolae Ceausescu had ruled Romania with an iron fist since 1965, transforming from a relatively moderate communist leader into one of Europe's most paranoid and brutal dictators. By December 1989, his regime had become a grotesque caricature of totalitarian control. Citizens were forced to worship him as a living god. His portrait hung in every home by law, and his secret police, the Securitate, had turned Romania into a surveillance state that would have impressed Stalin himself. The Securitate network was so extensive that neighbors spied on neighbors, children reported on their parents, and teachers monitored their students for any hint of disloyalty. An estimated 1 in 4 Romanians was either a Securitate agent or informer. This created a society where paranoia was not just justified, but necessary for survival. Speaking against the regime, even in private, could result in imprisonment, torture, or simply disappearance. The man who would die in 3 days had spent years constructing an elaborate personality cult around himself and his wife, Elena. They lived in obscene luxury while their people starved, literally. Children were dying of malnutrition while he built himself palaces that rivaled Versailles in their extravagance. His most notorious project was the Palace of the Parliament, a monstrous structure that required the demolition of entire historic neighborhoods and displaced over 40,000 people, while families huddled in freezing apartments. Ceausescu imported marble from around the world and commissioned chandeliers weighing tons. The palace consumed more electricity in a single day than many Romanian towns used in a month. But perhaps most revealing of his twisted psychology was his obsession with demographic control. Ceausescu had banned contraception and abortion, forcing women to bear children they couldn't feed in a country that couldn't support them. State-mandated gynecological exams ensured compliance with his breeding program. The result was tens of thousands of abandoned children living in horrific state orphanages that shocked the world when they were finally exposed. Yet on this cold December morning, as Ceausescu prepared for what he thought would be another routine propaganda rally, he remained utterly convinced of his own invincibility. The man who had outlasted Khrushchev, who had defied both Moscow and Washington, who had crushed every hint of dissent for nearly a quarter century, simply could not fathom that his own people might finally turn against him. This delusion would prove fatal. The spark that would ignite the Romanian Revolution came from an unlikely source: a Hungarian Reformed pastor named Laszlo Tokes in the city of Timișoara. When authorities attempted to evict him from his church, his congregation formed a human shield around the building. What began as a religious protest quickly transformed into something far more dangerous for the Ceausescu regime. The protest in Timișoara had been building for days, but the official Romanian media had maintained complete silence about them. In Ceausescu's Romania, bad news simply didn't exist in the official narrative. Protesters were dismissed as foreign agents and fascist hooligans, terms that had lost all meaning through decades of overuse, but still carried the threat of violent repression. But something had changed in the Romanian psyche. Perhaps it was the images seeping in from the rest of Eastern Europe, where communist regimes were falling like dominoes. Perhaps it was simply that the breaking point had finally been reached after decades of deprivation and terror. Whatever the cause, the fear that had kept Romanians silent for so long was beginning to crack. The government's response to Timișoara was typical of Ceausescu's approach to dissent: brutal and immediate. Security forces opened fire on protesters, killing dozens and wounding hundreds more. Bodies were loaded into trucks and driven away. Their families were never told what happened to them. It was a massacre that Ceausescu believed would end the protests immediately, just as violence had ended every previous challenge to his rule. Instead, it had the opposite effect. News of the killings spread despite the media blackout, carried by word of mouth and foreign radio broadcasts. The Romanian people, who had endured decades of oppression in silence, suddenly discovered that they were not alone in their hatred of the regime. The rally at the Central Committee building was supposed to be a show of strength. Ceausescu had called for it in response to the growing unrest, summoning what he expected would be a massive crowd of supporters to demonstrate their loyalty. His plan was simple: appear before the masses, deliver a speech condemning the foreign agitators and fascist elements responsible for the trouble, and remind everyone who was truly in charge. The preparation for this rally revealed much about how disconnected Ceausescu had become from reality. His advisors, terrified of bringing him bad news, had assured him that the situation was under control and that the people remained loyal. The buses that brought workers to the square were filled with the same carefully selected crowds that had attended every previous rally, people who knew exactly what was expected of them. For the first few minutes, everything proceeded according to script. The crowd below seemed attentive, even supportive. Ceausescu began his speech with the usual bombast, his voice carrying across the square through loudspeakers. He spoke about the achievements of Romanian socialism, the threat of foreign interference, and the need for vigilance against enemies of the state. It was a performance he had given hundreds of times before. But then something unprecedented happened, something that would later be described as the exact moment when fear changed sides in Romania. Someone in the crowd shouted. The words were unclear, but the tone was unmistakable. It was not support, but anger. Then another voice joined in, and another. The carefully orchestrated crowd began to fracture as genuine emotion broke through decades of enforced silence. Within seconds, what had been polite applause transformed into something far more sinister. A low, growing roar of anger that seemed to emerge from the very depths of the crowd's collective soul. The sound was unlike anything that had been heard in Romania for decades. The voice of a people who had suddenly remembered that they outnumbered their oppressors. The change in Ceausescu's face was instantaneous and devastating to witness. This was a man who had never, in 24 years of absolute power, experienced public defiance. The confusion that flickered across his features was almost pathetic, like watching a predator suddenly realize it had become prey. He tried to continue his speech, raising his voice above the growing din, but his words were lost in the chaos. Elena, standing beside him, grabbed his arm and whispered urgently in his ear. For the first time in decades, the Ceausescus looked like what they truly were: two frightened old people facing a mob that wanted their blood. What followed was perhaps the most dramatic retreat in political history. Ceausescu and his wife Elena fled back into the Central Committee building, but what had moments before been their seat of power had now become their tomb. Outside, the crowd's anger was reaching a fever pitch that decades of suppressed rage had finally unleashed. The building itself was a fortress designed to withstand both external attack and internal revolt. Its thick walls had been built to protect the communist elite from their own people, and now those same walls would trap the dictator inside as his world collapsed around him. The irony was not lost on the revolutionaries who would later storm the building. The couple barricaded themselves in the building's upper floors, surrounded by increasingly nervous security guards who were beginning to realize that their own survival might depend on distancing themselves from their former masters. These were men who had spent years carrying out the regime's most brutal orders, but they were also pragmatists who understood which way the wind was blowing. Phone calls were made to military commanders across the country, but the responses were not what Ceausescu expected. One by one, his generals were either refusing orders or simply not answering their phones. The army that had once been the backbone of his power was beginning to fragment as officers faced a choice between loyalty to the regime and survival. Elena Ceausescu, who had been her husband's closest partner in tyranny, was reportedly in a state of complete panic. This was a woman who had terrorized Romania's intellectual elite for decades, who had demanded that scientists address her as comrade, academician, doctor, engineer, despite having barely finished elementary school. She had built her power on fear and intimidation, using her position to destroy careers and lives on a whim. Now she was reduced to hysteria, screaming at security guards and demanding to know why the army wasn't crushing the protests immediately. Her voice, once capable of silencing entire university faculties with a single word, had become shrill and desperate. The transformation was complete, from feared dictator to terrified fugitive in a matter of hours. But the most chilling aspect of these hours wasn't the couple's fear. It was their complete inability to comprehend what was happening. Even as their world collapsed around them, they continued to speak as if they were still the absolute rulers of Romania, issuing orders that no one would obey and making threats that carried no weight. Reports from security personnel present during these hours describe a surreal scene where the Ceausescus seemed to exist in a parallel reality. They demanded updates on military operations that weren't happening, asked about loyal demonstrations that didn't exist, and planned responses to a crisis they fundamentally misunderstood. As dawn broke on December 22nd, it became clear that the Central Committee building could no longer protect them. The crowds outside had swelled to tens of thousands, and their chants had become increasingly specific about what they wanted to do to the couple inside. Military units that should have been defending the palace were either retreating or joining the protesters. The building's communications were failing as technicians abandoned their posts or actively sabotaged equipment. The few remaining loyal officials were providing increasingly desperate updates about the situation across the country. Cities that had been completely under regime control just hours earlier were now reporting full-scale revolts. The decision was made to evacuate by helicopter from the building's roof. This escape would later be remembered as one of the most desperate and pathetic moments in the history of political collapse. The dictator who had once commanded absolute obedience was reduced to fleeing like a common criminal, clutching a briefcase reportedly filled with foreign currency and gold. The helicopter pilot, later interviewed, described the couple's behavior during the flight as alternating between rage and terror. Nikolai continued to demand that they be taken to various military installations where he believed loyal forces were waiting, bases that had either been abandoned or were under revolutionary control. Elena reportedly kept asking why the people were turning against them after everything they had done for the good of Romania. The disconnect between her perception and reality was so complete that she seemed genuinely unable to understand why providing food, heat, and basic human dignity to their people hadn't earned them eternal gratitude. The pilot also reported that the couple had brought several suitcases filled with what appeared to be valuables and foreign currency, the resources they had accumulated while their people starved. Even in their moment of greatest crisis, they were more concerned with preserving their wealth than understanding the revolution that was destroying them. But their aerial escape would be short-lived. Within hours, even the helicopter crew would abandon them, leaving the once mighty dictator and his wife stranded in a countryside that had become as hostile to them as the capital they had fled. The search for the Ceausescus became a national obsession. Within hours of their escape, revolutionary committees sprang up in every town and village, all with the same goal: to capture the fleeing dictators before they could escape the country or organize a counterattack. The couple's appearance was broadcast repeatedly on radio and television, along with descriptions of the vehicles they might be using. Roadblocks appeared on every major highway, manned by a mixture of army units, police who had switched sides, and ordinary citizens armed with whatever weapons they could find. What made the search particularly intense was the widespread fear that Ceausescu might still have loyal forces somewhere in the country, Securitate units or foreign mercenaries who might attempt to rescue. Every hour that passed without their capture increased the anxiety of the provisional government and the revolutionary committees. The couple's capture, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic after the drama of their escape. Found hiding in a small town outside Bucharest, they were discovered by local officials who could barely contain their excitement at apprehending the most wanted people in Romania. The circumstances of their capture revealed just how completely their world had collapsed. These were people who had lived in palaces, who had been surrounded by servants and sycophants, who had never had to concern themselves with basic necessities like food or shelter. Now they were reduced to begging for help from strangers who recognized them and turned them over to authorities. But what followed their capture was anything but anticlimactic. It was a descent into a kind of revolutionary justice that was both swift and merciless. The provisional government that had emerged from the chaos made a decision that would haunt Romania for decades. Nikolai and Elena Ceausescu would face trial immediately, not in weeks or months, but within hours of their capture. The reasoning was simple but brutal. Every moment they remained alive was a moment that could allow loyalist forces to organize a rescue or counter-revolution. This was not justice in any conventional sense. It was revenge dressed up in legal clothing, and everyone involved knew it. The judges had been selected not for their legal expertise, but for their reliability in reaching the predetermined verdict. The charges had been written before the defendants were even in custody. The trial itself was a farce that lasted barely 2 hours, held in a small room in a military compound. It featured judges who had already decided on the verdict before hearing a single word of testimony. The couple was charged with genocide, undermining state power, and destroying Romania's economy. Charges that, while arguably accurate, were presented without any pretense of due process. The prosecution's case was a litany of horrors that had accumulated over nearly 25 years of dictatorship. The systematic starvation of the population while exporting food for foreign currency. The demolition of historic neighborhoods to build monuments to the dictator's ego. The forced institutionalization of children whose parents couldn't feed them. The transformation of an entire nation into a prison where citizens lived in constant fear of their own government. What made the proceedings particularly surreal was the couple's behavior throughout. Nikolai maintained his defiant stance, refusing to recognize the court's authority and repeatedly demanding to speak only to the National Assembly, a body that had long since ceased to exist as anything more than a rubber stamp for his decisions. Elena's behavior was even more revealing. She seemed to oscillate between fury and disbelief, at one point reportedly asking if this was all some kind of elaborate joke. Her inability to accept that the people she had oppressed for decades now held her life in their hands was perhaps the most damning evidence of how completely power had corrupted her perception of reality. The defense, such as it was, consisted mainly of the couple's own statements, rambling monologues that revealed their complete disconnection from the suffering they had caused. They spoke of their achievements, their sacrifices for the Romanian people, their role in defending the nation against foreign enemies that existed mainly in their imagination. As December 25th dawned, Christmas Day, the couple spent what would be their final hours in a small room under heavy guard. Reports from those present describe a scene of complete psychological collapse, particularly in Elena, who had gone from being one of the most feared women in Eastern Europe to a frightened old lady begging guards for basic dignities. The room itself was a stark contrast to the opulent palaces they had called home for decades. Bare walls, a simple bed, basic furniture. It was probably better than what many of their subjects had lived in, but for people accustomed to luxury beyond imagination, it must have felt like a tomb. Nikolai, by contrast, seemed to have retreated into a kind of delusional state where he still believed this was all a temporary setback. He reportedly spent time writing what he believed would be his triumphant return speech, confident that loyal forces would soon rescue them and restore their power. The complete disconnect from reality was both tragic and terrifying to witness. The guards assigned to watch them later described the couple's final conversations as a mixture of recriminations and desperate planning for a future that would never come. Elena blamed Nikolai for various political decisions that had led to their downfall, while he seemed unable to accept that their quarter-century of absolute power had truly ended. They discussed escape plans that were completely unrealistic, foreign contacts who might help them that probably didn't exist, and military units that might still be loyal despite all evidence to the contrary. It was the conversation of two people who had lived so long in a world of their own creation that they could no longer distinguish between fantasy and reality. The execution itself was carried out with a speed that shocked even those who had ordered it. On Christmas Day, 1989, Nikolai and Elena Ceausescu were led to a small courtyard where a hastily assembled firing squad waited. What happened next was captured on film. Grainy, horrifying footage that would later become one of the most controversial pieces of historical documentation ever recorded. The couple's final moments revealed the complete breakdown of their psychological defenses. Elena, who had once terrorized Romania's universities and research institutions, who had destroyed careers with a single word, who had lived like a queen while her people starved, was reduced to pleading for her life. Her final words were reportedly a desperate attempt to claim that she had been a mother to the Romanian people, that everything she had done was for their benefit. The irony was devastating. A woman who had presided over policies that literally starved children was claiming maternal feelings for the nation she had helped destroy. Nikolai, maintaining his defiance to the end, reportedly shouted revolutionary slogans even as the soldiers raised their weapons. But there was something pathetic about his final gesture of defiance, the desperate attempt of a man who had built his identity around being feared to maintain that facade even in the face of death. The execution was over in seconds, but its aftermath would reverberate for decades. The provisional government immediately broadcast footage of the dead dictators on national television, a decision that remains controversial to this day. Their reasoning was simple. The Romanian people needed to see with their own eyes that their tormentors were truly dead, that the nightmare was finally over. The images were brutal and shocking, but they served their purpose. Across Romania, people gathered around television sets and wept, not from sadness, but from relief and joy. The monsters who had haunted their lives for decades were gone, and the proof was there for all to see. But the images of their bullet-riddled bodies served another purpose as well. They were a message to anyone who might consider attempting to restore the old regime. This was the fate that awaited those who would terrorize the Romanian people. The deaths of Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu marked the end of one of Eastern Europe's most brutal dictatorships, but they also raised troubling questions about the nature of revolutionary justice. Their execution was swift, decisive, and arguably necessary to prevent a civil war, but it was also a clear violation of every principle of due process and human rights that the new Romania claimed to embrace. In the years that followed, many of those involved in the trial and execution would express ambivalence about what they had done. They recognized the historical necessity of ending the Ceausescu regime quickly and definitively, but they also understood that the manner of their deaths had set a precedent that was difficult to reconcile with democratic values. The speed of the entire process, from capture to execution in less than 72 hours, reflected both the revolutionary fury of the moment and the practical necessities of preventing a counter-revolution. But it also meant that many secrets died with the dictators, and many questions about their regime would never be fully answered. The couple's final hours also revealed something profound about the nature of absolute power and its ultimate fragility. These were people who had commanded the lives and deaths of millions, who had lived like gods among mortals, who had genuinely believed themselves to be indispensable to their nation's survival. Yet when the moment of reckoning came, they proved to be as mortal and vulnerable as any of their victims. Their deaths marked not just the end of their lives, but the end of an entire era in Romanian history. The surveillance state they had constructed crumbled within days. The personality cult that had sustained their rule evaporated like morning mist. The fear that had kept their people silent was replaced by a joy so intense that it seemed to physically transform the nation itself. The brutal final hours of Nicolae Ceausescu serve as a stark reminder that no dictator, no matter how seemingly secure their power, is immune to the ultimate judgment of their people. His quarter-century reign of terror ended not with the grand historical drama he might have imagined, but with a pathetic scramble for survival that exposed the emptiness at the heart of his regime. The speed of his fall, from absolute dictator to executed criminal in just 72 hours, remains one of the most dramatic collapses in modern political history. It demonstrated that even the most entrenched tyranny can crumble with shocking suddenness when the people's tolerance for oppression finally reaches its breaking point. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Ceausescu's final hours was not his fear or his desperation, but his fundamental inability to understand why his people had turned against him. This was a man so isolated by power, so insulated by sycophancy, so deluded by his own propaganda that he genuinely could not comprehend that decades of brutality might eventually provoke a violent response. The revolution that destroyed him was not the work of foreign agents or fascist conspirators, as he had claimed throughout his final days. It was the spontaneous uprising of a people who had finally reached the limit of their endurance. The children he had condemned to starvation, the families he had torn apart, the intellectuals he had silenced, the workers he had exploited. They had all become part of a vast accounting that was finally being settled. In the end, Nicolae Ceausescu's last hours were not just the death throes of a dictator, but a cautionary tale about the ultimate price of absolute power. They remind us that those who rule through fear must eventually reckon with the accumulated rage of their victims, and that reckoning, when it comes, can be as swift and merciless as the oppression that provoked it. The dictator who once declared himself the eternal leader of Romania discovered in his final moments that the only thing truly eternal about tyranny is the hatred it generates. And eventually, that hatred will have its day of reckoning. The man who had spent decades building monuments to his own greatness. What made the search particularly intense was the widespread fear that Ceausescu might still have loyal forces somewhere in the country, Securitate units or foreign mercenaries who might attempt a rescue. Every hour that passed without their capture increased the anxiety of the provisional government and the revolutionary committees. The couple's capture, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic after the drama of their escape. Found hiding in a small town outside Bucharest, they were discovered by local officials who could barely contain their excitement at apprehending the most wanted people in Romania. The circumstances of their capture revealed just how completely their world had collapsed. These were people who had lived in palaces, who had been surrounded by servants and sycophants, who had never had to concern themselves with basic necessities like food or shelter. Now they were reduced to begging for help from strangers who recognized them and turned them over to authorities. But what followed their capture was anything but anticlimactic. It was a descent into a kind of revolutionary justice that was both swift and merciless. The provisional government that had emerged from the chaos made a decision that would haunt Romania for decades. Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu would face trial immediately, not in weeks or months, but within hours of their capture. The reasoning was simple but brutal. Every moment they remained alive was a moment that could allow loyalist forces to organize a rescue or counter-revolution. This was not justice in any conventional sense. It was revenge dressed up in legal clothing, and everyone involved knew it. The judges had been selected not for their legal expertise, but for their reliability in reaching the predetermined verdict. The charges had been written before the defendants were even in custody. The trial itself was a farce that lasted barely 2 hours, held in a small room in a military compound. It featured judges, left behind only the memory of suffering and the relief of a nation finally free from his shadow.